My first question is actually for you, Dr. Wheatland. I noticed, and I don't know if it was an exact correlation in your talk to what I'm thinking of, but I noticed in your talk you used the term just war, and then at the end you made the very good point of teaching our students why we should go to war, or maybe why we shouldn't. So I wanted to know what your thoughts were on Augustine's just war theory, and does that have any kind of influence on the fathers and on American founding, or would that be something kind of far off because they're more post-Enlightenment or Enlightenment thinking?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And if you're thinking of, well, first off, who immediately influenced the founders? So what were the most direct people that they tended to look to and read in order to understand the law of nations, this question of just wars or unjust wars? There's a group of European thinkers that you can think of as these just war law of nations theorists. Samuel Pufendorf, who is German, Emmanuel Vattel, who is Swiss, and Hugo Grotius, who is Dutch. There is, I think, a line between those thinkers that you could bring all the way back to St. Augustine. I think the line is this. War is assumed, I think, to be unjust. The just wars are in a way the exceptions, right? There are certain circumstances in which it makes sense, in which it is advantageous and morally proper for a nation to wield arms against another nation. There is a transformation, I would argue, of just war thinking that emerges in the Westphalian period, as Dr. Lippincott noted, right? Because in the pre-Westphalian, pre-17th century Europe, there's this question of religious warfare, right? How do you treat warfare between co-religionists versus warfare between those who do not hold your religion? There's these questions of, you could say, crusading in the broad sense of the term of, all right, a nation is doing something unjust, we have to go in and intervene. In the Westphalian period, and this is where you see Vattel, Grotius, Pufendorf, there's the assumption that no, nations have sovereignty. They have this independence, and that independence is the foundation for their political actions, right? You do not violate the sovereignty of another nation, even if that nation is founded upon or is committing actions that are contrary to your own conception of justice. As all that is to say, I think there is a line between that earlier Christian just war theory and the founding. It's maybe not a direct line. I think it's filtered and ciphered through these other thinkers and historical events.
Thank you. So I guess this question is most directly for Professor Lippincott. So you talked about the way that various countries have come, or that we have come up with moral judgments that we place on various things that go on during war. So we're in an interesting phenomenon right now. In 1648, Europe started fighting a large number of wars. After every war, two things happened. Borders were redrawn and populations were transferred. And that went on for 300 years until around 1948, when Europe decided they liked where the borders were and the populations had already been moved around the continent. And they then declared both of those practices off limits and inhumane. And as a result, we no longer resolve conflicts. We have forever wars. We trap people in multi-generational conflicts, and we set them up for genocide. Are we going to get back to a point where we actually notice that redrawing borders and moving populations, while they may be unjust in and of themselves, are frequently least bad and can be evaluated in a least bad environment as opposed to a standalone unjust environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will just add something to what you said there. There was a vast population transfer in the aftermath of World War II. Lvov, which is now in the Ukraine, used to have Poles, Jews, and Ukrainians. Now it's just Ukrainians, right? Like, there's a massive population transfer after the war and the redrawing of the maps. But the deeper question, I think, goes to this idea of sovereignty. And I typically, and I look at the progressive view, the idea that there's an authority that's going to say, these borders are sacred now, right? And there's an authority that gets to say that they're sacred. Well, what authority is that? Well, it's really America and American liberals, right? This is justice. We drew up the map. And why can we do that? Because we're right. We know what justice is. We stand for freedom, democracy, and equality. So you're about to do what you're going to do what we tell you to do. And I think that view, ironically, is a very imperialistic model, and it's one that denies sovereignty. Well, you know, there's just a question here about Augustine's just war theory, and I'm just pulling this up on my phone. One of the key aspects is legitimate authority wages war. That's the crux of the matter. What qualifies as legitimate authority? And the older system acknowledged that every authority thinks it's legitimate, right? And there's but you have to then accept there's violence and brutality that's in that system. Borders are going to change. But that's not then a cause for everyone else to go into conflict. Look at Russia and Ukraine. Okay, when the Soviet Union possessed Ukraine, and some of you are probably old enough to remember that, Americans were not like, hey, we should go start a war in Ukraine, right? Well, but now the border is sacred. Well, that's really complicated. And what do ordinary Americans have to do with whether the Donetsk and Luhansk are under this political order or another? And I can say the older view would have said, okay, that moral view of the world is detached from our own interest. It deals with the sovereignty abroad. We should not be involved there. So could we go back to that view? Very plausibly so. And I think there's a lot of reason to think that the future of warfare especially will not lend itself to intervention abroad.
If I could jump in on that. Sure. In the early 1990s, when they were discussing what to do with Russia after the Soviet Union, one proposal was to actually redraw the borders of Russia, right? Divide Russia up into 3 separate republics. It wasn't seriously pursued, at least publicly not, right? I was just teaching this in a foreign policy class yesterday morning, so students asked, would this happen again, right? And if Russia loses, right, I think we could see like that as a real possibility again. But it won't be a impartial, everyone agrees that the new world order, right, or international law is going to encompass changing borders, right, and transitioning populations from one country to another. They might like transing them. But it'll just be that who's in charge of the liberal world order will get to, draw on the map what is the borders of Russia, who gets self-determination and who doesn't, right? So we could return to it, but it may not be exactly what it was in the past.
I would like to raise a question to Professor Wheatland regarding a federalist. So if I recall correctly, Hamilton wrote that something like this: to be more safe, people at length run the risk of being less free. So the Federalist was written in the late 18th century, and I would argue that in the 240 years difference, globalization very much changed the world map. And if we now look at the Ukrainian war and Iranian war, we can now see that military strength is not the only role that now is securing a country, but rather also economic independency, which is the reason why Iran and Ukraine are still standing. So my question would be to you, and also what you think Mr. Hamilton would argue, how economic interdependency, what role it plays in securing liberty.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Paul's one of my students, and he always asks me these million-dollar questions, so I'm getting used to fielding them. And let me just start. This is something that I did not explicitly state in the talk, but how do republics secure themselves as opposed to empires? Right, if you're thinking about this from the lens of the founders or of Montesquieu, who I think says this more explicitly, well, empires protect themselves by having frontiers. Right? They expand, they might have border states that serve as vassals and are perhaps buffers against other rivals. And so empires do not maintain or tend to maintain static borders as the sort of center of their security strategy. Whereas republics, I would argue, the security of a republic depends primarily on the border. It depends primarily on, are you able to keep potential enemies on the other side of the border? And you have to do this in order to be able to distinguish between who should be a citizen and who should not be a citizen. Right? Who should be in this country, who should not be in this country, who should be in this republic specifically. Right? Republics tend to, I think, have this border-centric approach to security. And the reason that you would have a border-centric approach is because this is the best way to preserve civil and political liberty. Right? If you do not have a border-centric approach, that might mean that you need to have more internal surveillance, more of an internal security apparatus. And to your point about globalization, I would argue that's largely what you have today. And this is something I always like to bring up when I'm teaching Federalist 8 to my students. And I always teach Federalist 8 before I get to 9 and 10. A lot of people like to skip to 9 and 10. I think you have to read 8 in order to really understand what's going on in those ones. Is I say, well, this Hamilton line, right? People are willing to give up liberty in order to better have their safety. Well, have there been any examples of that in contemporary American life? I'm old enough to remember pre-9/11 America. It was a different atmosphere, right? That September 12, 2001, there is a state of abject fear in the country. It is pervasive. And that led to particular decisions about internal surveillance and new security apparatuses that primarily meant treating Americans themselves as potential enemies, as opposed to distinguishing between citizen and non-citizen, between borders and non-borders. So to get to the question about economic interdependence, Hamilton is pro-trade. Right? He thinks that America, as it is emerging, needs to develop manufacturing, and that means that it is going to have commerce with other nations. There needs to be exchange of material in order to benefit both nations. Right? Trade has self-interest on both sides. But Hamilton believed that in order for this to be accomplished in a way that preserves American sovereignty, which means ultimately preserving American liberty, you have to have a proper manufacturing apparatus at home. And so you have to be able to feed yourself as a nation. You have to be able to arm yourself as a nation. You have to be able to do those things that are absolutely existential to your survival. If you outsource those things to other nations, even if it's in a mode of economic interdependence, that might be in the interest of you, that might be in the interest of the other nation. But Hamilton says in Federal 6, the problem with international affairs is that nations don't always serve their own interests. They act irrationally. Right? Hamilton says it would be in the interest of every nation to have peace all the time with all of its neighbors. But Hamilton says that's not human nature, that's not reality. And so I think Hamilton's concern would be if you have economic interdependence to the extent that you cannot provide for your own existential necessities, primarily food and weaponry, then you are leaving yourself in a precarious situation in which if your relations deteriorate with those other nations, even if it's mutually beneficial to have trade, those other nations are going to forego those beneficial trade relations, and then you are left to the mercy of other nations for your food, for your weapons, and for your overall security.
All right, this question is for Dr. Wheatland. With regards to the immigration and assimilation of an immigration and the threat that posed and the creation of factions, how much were the Founding Fathers for, or did they recognize the idea that, you know, an official language not being established could become a threat? Like when we look at large cities these days, that we have the regions that, you know, Chinatown in New York, for being from New York, did they foresee that? Did they not just anticipate that, hey, without English being an official language, we set ourselves up for this in the future?
That might be a question for Dr. Brown, because wasn't Franklin concerned that you had all the German speakers in Pennsylvania? To speak to the founders' concern about immigration, I think it was thought of as part broadly of foreign policy and national security, right? The founders believe, well, there's times in which immigration is beneficial to you, right? And the founders especially thought as the Republic is being formed, you have this vast continent, you have all this land, there you need farming, you need more population in order to survive in this world of empires. And so they said, yes, all right, immigration, but it needs to be done in a way that allows for assimilation to ensure that you do not end up having what are essentially ethnic enclaves within your political community, right? And what I mean by ethnic enclaves is that you end up having a sort of these ethnic ties that are stronger than your broader ties of national identity and lead to a kind of spoil system within your politics. Thomas Jefferson, in I think it was Query 8 of the Notes on the State of Virginia, said that what's distinct about the American regime is that it takes these elements of England, of English common law and English politics, and combines them with this more fuller understanding of natural rights. And Jefferson warned that, well, if you have mass immigration from nations that don't have that same foundation, and Jefferson thought this was a unique foundation, you could end up having this ethnic spoil system that emerges, right? Your politics becomes this essentially competition between different groups that might not even speak the same language. And Hamilton actually repeats this and throws this back in Jefferson's face when Jefferson is president. And there's this haggling over what naturalization law should look like in the United States. How long should immigrants have to remain in the United States before they can become citizens? And Hamilton expands on this principle. And so they all, I think, recognized or thought that it was necessary that, of course, you're going to have the same language, right? As Jerry said in Federalist 3, right, you have a free and wise people. They have to deliberate amongst themselves. Right? If you don't have the same language, then you don't have the foundation for politics. You don't have the foundation, at least for free politics, because you can't deliberate with your fellow citizens. And in Federalist 2, Jay says this is one of the reasons why America can be a nation, is the simple fact that there's a common language. Right? There's cultural ties, religious ties, things like that. But the first thing is there's a common language. You can actually talk to each other. Right? So I think they took it for granted that you would have that. Very good question.
If I could add just on the Franklin part, Franklin did try to force down or force the German immigrants to speak English. He wanted to not ban German schools, but certainly make learning English part of their education. And eventually he gave up on that, partly for political reasons because it wasn't very popular, but also because he realized it's just natural for man to want to speak the language that is his own. And so I think it would be considered consistent with liberty to allow them to speak their language, but Franklin would never say, like, speak German to the Germans. He would just be speak English to them, and they have to learn how to speak English if they want to live amongst us. My own ancestors were among those Germans that caused Franklin headache. And I noticed when I was looking into the family tree that we were originally bronze when we came over here, and then after 1776 we were now browns. So there was, I think the idea of being part of this American identity led a lot of these non-Anglo immigrant communities to immediately, not immediately anglicize, but they certainly had incentives to do, because now they weren't just German, right, or English, right? They were American, and Americans speak English, but then they might speak English a little funnier than others.
Yeah, I don't know if the Texans speak English, but point taken. I lived in Texas, I can make that joke.
One common denominator that was brought up was, the whole issue of borders. And Dr. Lippincott had talked about aggression as a moral concept, starting with Spanish-American War. And also the fact that it's just, all this is in the context of Europe. And I look at what has happened like in the continent of Africa. And there's an incredible injustice, and we can see the results of, those borders really don't mean anything. You've got, this tribe here, but it's also, when the Europeans drew these lines, it had no concept of a homogeneous unit, that this tribe actually spans, quite a different geography. And I just thought that was interesting in the sense that, how much can we, obviously in Europe, borders mean a lot more. But in the case of a place like Africa, the borders kind of maybe are irrelevant.
Just to draw on the point of the social contract and choice and its role in the formation of a political regime. What makes American borders meaningful or viable is that Americans chose them, right? There's Americans within them. And so when a border is imposed from outside, then what meaning does it have for those people? That's not the way they would have chosen to arrange their own sovereignty insofar as they could do so at all, or at that ability to unify to that degree. And I think there's just been a breakdown in international law, just the idea of consent in a meaningful way. Like, there's a lot of coercion even in our own system. It is the month of April. We're just paying taxes. Like, how much consent is going on in our system as to how that money's being spent? It's tens. I mean, it's something like $10 trillion plus that's gained every year. So, and that's just here. So there's really, I think, been a breaking of consent and borders and a sense of what a people is, and that's certainly an issue that we'll confront going forward, not just in America, but around the world.
I mean, we found the sovereignty of Ukraine to be so offensive, and yet we agreed to the split of northern Chad and southern Chad because they're so, such varied situations.
It's just, it is. One of the things is you have this moralizing view, but it's often inconsistently applied. For instance, think about World War II, right? Hitler is the worst person ever because he invades Poland in September of 1939. You know who else invaded Poland in September of 1939? Joseph Stalin, our ally. We gave that guy the equivalent of like $300 billion in today's money. It's like, well, how does that go together with commitment to freedom and democracy? Well, it turns out there's a bunch of communists and leftists in liberal circles, and it was just a different view, and there's a way you can write a 10,000-word essay about how that can all go together. But I think it points to the problem with a lot of these interventions is you start to realize how much you don't know. And one of the shocking features of like American geopolitics is how little our policymakers know about the world around us. I'm reading Michael Axworthy's book on the history of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And he points out that in 1979, none of the CIA officers in the embassy in Tehran knew Farsi. They did not speak the local language. They did not know. They didn't interact with Iranians on a day-to-day basis. So on the one hand, you have all this moral view about spreading democracy, equality, freedom, managing the world in the name of uplift. On the other hand, like a shocking ignorance of things like basic history and amazingly, the American embassy staff did not know the history of America in Iran. So you have Iranians who are holding them hostage, these Iranian students, yelling about 1953 and the CIA overthrowing the government, and the Americans are like, no idea that happened, right? And they just didn't. There's a real problem here. There's a need for humility, I think.
And to that point about knowledge, one of the first major imperatives that the government had, the American nation had once the government is formed and we secured independence from Great Britain, is to establish diplomatic ties with other nations. That requires sending ministers abroad and being able to then communicate with those other nations. And if you look at early American policy, there's not many what Jefferson called entangling alliances, right? We're not having too many military treaties. To the extent that they're very temporary. Yet there was expansive knowledge of the situation of these foreign nations. You take John Quincy Adams, for example. John Quincy Adams, as a boy, travels with his father, John Adams, to Europe to serve as his secretary as he's negotiating with France. John Quincy Adams ends up having this illustrious diplomatic career in which he goes to Netherlands, to Russia, to Prussia. During the course of his career, John Quincy Adams learns Italian, Dutch, Russian, German, Latin, Greek, I think one other language, too.
English.
Oh, yeah, well, he knew English, yeah. He's not a Texan. He didn't say y'all. He spoke the Queen's English. But that's an incredible array of knowledge, but it was expected that you would have a diplomatic corps that would know the languages and know the local circumstances, not so that we could get involved necessarily in their situations, but so that we could reach some sort of mutual understanding with those other nations in order to preserve a peace that was in mutual interest between our nation and their nations.
I'd like to ask one question, if I might, of the panel. The idea of empire is specifically of fuzzy borders, right? And so they are malleable as the power allows. So as we are a growing country, we are confronting, emerging out of the moment of independence, we are confronting a continent that still has French and Spanish influence, in addition to indigenous Indian populations. So how did the ontology of empire, or the idea of fuzzy boundaries, how did that influence the way our founders thought about the opportunity for expanding territory, and especially with the prior strength of the European empires that claimed the land.
Well, I think whenever the founders or early American Republican era presidents justified territorial expansion, the first argument they always made was it's necessary for our defense. So we can't have Great Britain on our borders. Jefferson, when he finds out that the Louisiana territory might become possible, he writes, whoever has control, if Napoleon takes the Louisiana territory back from the Spanish, right, because it was at the time the French had given it to the Spanish, if he has control of New Orleans, of the Mississippi, then that's a foreign power who has effective control over our sovereignty, who has control of our economic opportunities, right, our ability to trade. We no longer have access to the Gulf of Mexico. We are substantially limited in our access to the Atlantic, or at least the southern Atlantic. We no longer can navigate from the southern parts of our union towards the northern parts. So territorial expansion was, the primary justification was security, right? We need to be able to secure ourselves, and therefore will expand to that point that is necessary for defense. Jefferson also says, and this is in the same letter I quoted when he's writing to James Madison, when he talks about the Empire of Liberty, he talks about Cuba, and he says, I would be fine with taking Cuba. You know, he envisions the deal being Napoleon is concerned about the United States siding with the Mexicans as they're revolting against the Spanish and Napoleonic Empire. And he says, you know, we will not get involved, but we will take Cuba. And he makes the argument, and if we take Cuba, I will plant a massive signpost right there that says ne plus ultra, right? This is the furthest extent we will go south. And his argument is we can defend Cuba without needing a navy, right? We can easily get troops to Cuba and back within a day or two. But if you need a navy, if you need a prolonged naval campaign to defend your territory, then you should not own that territory, right? So the Philippines certainly would be out of the question. Probably Hawaii as well. Basically, it has to be contiguous in some sense to the actual American territory. Going further, when Manifest Destiny is underway, during the Lincoln-Douglas debate, Stephen Douglas makes the argument, if Americans need the space, then America should procure that space, right? It doesn't matter if it's to the north or to the south or it's the Caribbean islands. If we need the space in order for Americans to thrive and flourish, then Americans should acquire it. Lincoln, in response to that, says, okay, but what are you going to do about the Mexicans then, right? Because Douglas is not a fan of the Mexicans. So are you going to allow them to become American citizens? You don't want that. Are you going to allow them, are we going to subjugate them, right, and rule over them? Well, that's not consistent with your own ideals of popular sovereignty, Stephen Douglas. So it's, I would say, national security or territorial defense, right, is the first limit. And then it's going to be, does expansion require us to fundamentally change the character of our government? If we're going to rule over other peoples without their consent, and we have no intention of ever allowing them to enter into our republic, then we should not do that.
One note I'll make briefly on fuzzy borders is this was a real serious concrete problem. How did America acquire Florida? The place where we are right now, how did this transform from a Spanish colony to American territory? Well, the answer to that is the 1819 Adams-Lenease Treaty signed under President James Monroe. Right? John Quincy Adams, illustrious diplomat, is serving as Secretary of State at the time. Florida is a real national security problem as a Spanish colony, not so much because Spain was projecting power from there, right? There's this thing with these empires where on the one hand they have the potential to be very strong, but they can also be very weak and difficult to police their own borders and their own territories. Florida was at this time what today we might call a failed state. You had roving bands of pirates and bandits in the Spanish territory who would often cross the border and harass American merchants. Right? Andrew Jackson at one point leads something of an invasion of Florida. And when this happens, it is an outrage. Although the one person in the cabinet who defended General Jackson was in fact John Quincy Adams, which is interesting because they're typically rivals. But this 1819 treaty that was signed with Spain, right, what did it do? Well, Florida was transferred to the United States, and this solves the security problem because now America can govern Florida. We can put down crime. We can end this piracy because Spain was not able to control its own people and its own borders. And also what it also did was fix the borders in the West between the Spanish Empire and the United States. And Spain got concessions in that, got some of what it wanted, but it helped to clarify the border, which meant you were going to have fewer moments of disagreement and potential crises between these two nations. And so that having those fixed borders was absolutely a national security imperative early on.
Join us in falling in love with America again.